Hi everyone. In this video today, we're going to be talking about vitamin B12. Um, Welcome to the channel. Let's get right into it. So in the video, we're going to focus on a few things. We're going to focus on the mechanism of how our body absorbs vitamin B12. We're going to focus on how it metabolizes B12. We're going to talk about the regulation of B12 in our bodies. We're also going to talk about the enzymes required in all of this. We're going to touch upon what happens a little bit when we don't have enough B12 in our bodies. And then at the end, we're going to actually cover some common food sources and dietary recommendations of how much B12 we actually need to be consuming. So there we go. Let's get into it. Bonus points if you know why there's a picture of clams here. First thing we need to talk about is what vitamin B12 actually is. So another name for vitamin B12 is cobalamin, which you may have heard of or come across. The chemical structure will be in the bottom right of this slide. Essentially, vitamin B12 is a water-soluble vitamin. So what does that mean? That means that no matter how much of it you actually have, you will pee or urinate it out because it is water-soluble. So vitamin B12 is important for a number of reasons in our bodies, but it's most important for our central nervous system and the well-being of our red blood cells. So where does the vitamin B12 actually come from? So it's produced by bacteria and archaea. So this means that it's not produced by plants, by fungi, or by animals. Now, what does this actually mean? So this means that plants and animals don't actually produce it, and an animal actually gets it from ingesting the bacteria, as mentioned before. So this is why it's actually a problem in people who adopt a vegetarian diet, because they can become deficient in the vitamin as there's not enough of it when they're ingesting just plants. So now we're going to discuss the process of B12 in our bodies and the path it takes after we first ingest it. So how do we absorb B12? So the whole story starts in our salivary glands. So in our salivary glands, we produce something called haptocorin. This is something that binds to the B12 when we eat it. Think of it as a taxi for the B12 waiting for it in our mouths. This complex of B12 and haptocorin gets then transported to our stomachs. Now, the stomach is quite an acidic environment, and the whole point of the haptocorin is that it protects the B12 from the acidic environment of the stomach. So it's not necessarily a taxi, like I said before, but rather a taxi and a bodyguard. If the haptocorin wasn't there, then the B12 would be getting degraded in the stomach and thus being useless. Now, an important thing to mention about the stomach in this case is that it contains something called parietal cells. So the parietal cells in the stomach produce something called HCl or hydrochloric acid, as well as something called intrinsic factor. So once our complex of B12 and haptocorin passes through the stomach, it enters the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. In the duodenum, there's an area where the pancreas secretes pancreatic proteases into it, and they then release the B12 from the haptocorin. So they separate it from that complex. After that happens, the vitamin B12 binds to intrinsic factor, which we mentioned earlier on, that comes from the parietal cells. This new complex of vitamin B12 and now intrinsic factor then goes to the second and third parts of the small intestine, which are called the jejunum and the ileum. Now, in the last part of the ileum, which we call the terminal ileum, that's where the B12 gets removed from the intrinsic factor and gets absorbed into the bloodstream. Now here is where the B12 yet again binds to something called transcobalamin to make its third complex of this overall journey. There's also a bit of haptocorin from the bloodstream that helps transport the B12 here as well. So our complex goes through the portal vein then, and it goes to the liver, where it gets stored. Now the liver is a major storage center of B12, so it can store anywhere up to 2 to 5 milligrams of B12. Once our B12 goes through the liver and the circulation, some of the B12 gets urinated out, like we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, but also can be reabsorbed through the kidneys in the renal tubules via myelin. Now, this whole process is quite time-consuming and energy-consuming, and thus the body has a decent way of trying to retain the B12 and making sure not all that effort was in vain. If anywhere along this journey there's a disruption of how our B12 gets absorbed, then we'll have trouble. So think about the parietal cells, for example, in the stomach, or think about the terminal ileum, which is the place where the B12 gets absorbed. You may have heard of things like pernicious anemia, which we'll save for another video. Now let's talk about why we actually need the B12. So why does our body go through this whole process of absorbing it, and then even reabsorbing it? What's the point of it all? All right. So in our bodies we have two important enzymes that really require vitamin B12. The first of these enzymes is called homocysteine methyltransferase, or HMT. So we have homocysteine that gets converted to methionine with the help of HMT, or homocysteine methyltransferase. Second enzyme that requires vitamin B12 is methylmalonyl-CoA mutase. So here it's a bit different. We have methionine, which gets converted to methylmalonyl-CoA, and then that gets converted to succinyl-CoA with the help of methylmalonyl-CoA mutase, or MMCM. If MMCM doesn't help this process, then our methylmalonyl-CoA instead gets converted to methylmalonic acid, which is not a good thing because when there's a buildup of this acid, then it can cause some of the symptoms we actually get, such as fatigue, axonal neuropathy, motor issues, and so on. So overall, we need vitamin B12 for these two enzymes to facilitate these two pathways, and when it's lacking in our bodies, then we run into trouble. Other symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency can be a lack of energy, pins and needles, which we call paresthesia, things like mouth ulcers, disturbed vision, and even psychological issues like depression and anxiety. So now we know why we need vitamin B12 in our diets. Now let's see how much of it we actually need on a daily basis. So usually on birth and in the first few years of life, we need between 0.5 to 1 micrograms of vitamin B12. Adults need about 2.4 micrograms. In pregnancy, the demands on our bodies are greater, so we need a bit more, around 2.6 micrograms, as well as in lactation at about 2.8. So I guess the important one to remember here is that adults need about 2.4 micrograms, and pregnancy and lactation need a bit more. Here we have a picture of a king crab, which is a big source of vitamin B12. The reason I put that picture of clams at the beginning of the video is because, to my knowledge, that's the biggest source of vitamin B12 content. There are other sources of vitamin B12, such as grass-fed beef liver, trout, salmon, tuna, cow milk, yogurt, Swiss cheese, and roast turkey. So overall, vitamin B12 is a water-soluble nutrient required to make healthy red blood cells, supports brain health, make DNA, metabolize homocysteine, and prevent certain things like pernicious anemia, which we'll talk about in another video. It comes typically from animal sources of protein, so fish, meat, poultry, eggs, but it's not found in fruits or vegetables, and it's not produced by animals or plants. Anyways, that was a quick video on vitamin B12. We'll be making future videos about vitamin B12 in terms of deficiencies, medications that can impact it, and so on. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.